Right, so good evening, everybody. This is your Mod 3 review session. I'm hoping that we'll be done here in about 2.5 hours, depending on how many questions that we do have. But the point of this is to clarify anything that you did not understand in class and to also go over important key points on this one, right? So the first one as I want to cover is your scene size up, which is basically chapter 11. So like I said, we're going to start with a broad perspective first. Like, let's see what we're going to talk about in this chapter, and then we're going to talk about the small details. So I'm going to start the share screen. For those of you that are using your email phones, that are not seeing the share screen, simply log into your email. You should be able to pull up the PowerPoints as well, right? So I'm about to share screen right now. Desktop. Okay. Share screen. All right. Where is my PowerPoint? Mod 3 guides. There we go. Right, so let's start with the scene size up. Like I said, I do not see you guys, so and I don't see any chat box. If you do have any questions, please let me know. But just one person or one or two, can you see the screen right now? Yes or no? Just on the mic.
Yeet. Yep.
Okay, cool. That's all I need. Okay, not everybody has to yell. Cool beans. All right, so let's start with the scene size up process. So first of all, on the scene size up, there's 4 parts in your book listed, but this is exactly what scene size up contains. BSI is my scene safe, right? BSI, proper PPE. And then you're going to determine whether it's a mechanism of injury or whether it's the nature of illness. And we all know that the mechanism of injury, right? The mechanism of injury will be the one for your trauma. Okay, and the nature of illness will be the one for your medical patients, right? Then you have to determine the number of patients that you will encounter, because this will determine whether or not you're going to need additional help so that they can bring more equipment. And then this 5th step right here, please mute your microphones.
What?
The 5th step right here is taking C-spine precautions. As you can see, I added something on the parenthesis right here. Whether or not you're going to take C-spine precautions, right? Because not everybody needs to have a stabilized C-spine. For example, if I'm having shortness of breath, I don't really need to have my C-spine stabilized. But if I have a significant mechanism of injury, for example, a car accident, I'm probably going to have my partner manually stabilize the C-spine. So that's why C-spine precautions is on there. So these are your 5 steps. Like I said, you have this on your email, but I just wanted to do a quick share on this one, okay? So again, BSI scene safe, my MOI is, NOI is, number of patient is, I will have ALS or additional help on standby. For those of you that don't know what ALS is, that basically stands for advanced life support. And then the C-spine precautions, right? So that is basically just general overview of your scene size up. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share and then I'm going to go back to you guys. So did everybody get those 5 specific steps for your scene size up? Everybody good? Okay, cool. Right, so why is that important? Because when you're being asked in the test about what is the first thing, what is the next step, if you don't know where you're at in your patient assessment process, whether in your secondary, am I my primary, am I my scene size up, you will get lost. That's why I like breaking it down that style, okay? So on your scene size up, part of it is identifying your safety first, okay? So part of that is your danger zones. In your textbooks on page 265, for those of you that are following on the book, there's different ways of how we're gonna establish danger zones. First, if there's no hazards, 50 feet in all directions, okay? 50 feet, 50 in all directions. If there's fuel or fire, we're gonna part 100 feet, okay? 100 feet in all directions, fuel and fire. That's kind of easy because fuel and fire kind of go hand in hand. And then if there are wires that are down, we're gonna park 1 full span, okay? 1 full span of electrical wires that are down, because again, we might be grounded if we park close to it. And then if we have a hazardous material involved, simple fix. We reference the ERG, or the what we call the emergency response guidebook. Because if we don't know what's the hazardous material and we kind of come in contact with it, we might harm ourselves as well, okay? So again, no hazards, 50 feet, fire fuel, 100 feet in all directions, okay? And then if there's wires are down, 1 full wire span, and then hazardous material is the emergency response guidebook. It is on page 265. Right, moving on, page 267. Violence is another thing. So we talked about danger zones when there's a collision vehicle. Violence is a very common thing. You have to be careful as an EMT that there's any sort of violence or signs of violence present. We want to make sure that the scene is safe first. For example, a husband has as a gun, and then behind the husband is a wife that is bleeding out. The scene is technically not safe because you're not trained how to basically take down somebody that has a gun, right? So you want to make sure that the scene's safe first. Or somebody who is intoxicated with alcohol, and there's drugs there, and they're kind of being rowdy. We might have to have law enforcement on standby on that one because the scene is not safe. Okay, so that's basically a quick scene size up things in terms of safety. Okay, so whose safety is important first? Very good. Our safety, and then our partner, right? And then after that, we also have our patient as the last one. Okay, so those are your basic scene size up techniques. Then it's time for you to determine your nature of calls. Remember, BSI is my scene safe, my MOI or NOI. Well, MOI, mechanism of injury, is for trauma. Okay, mechanism of injury is specifically for trauma. There's different types of mechanism of injury listed in your textbook. First of all, motor vehicle collision, aka car crashes, right? So we have different types of collisions. As long as you know what type of injuries there's going to be in that collision, that's all we need to know. You don't need to memorize. You don't need to know what it looks like. You just have to know, as an EMT, what type of injuries am I going to get on a head-on collision? Well, on a head-on collision, we have the up and over pattern, right? Because your face could have smashed, or the head could have smashed the windshield. We also have the down and under. So basically anything from the pelvis downwards all the way up to your toes, okay? Another thing is rear end collisions. When there's a rear end collision, we might get some head, neck, and injury, very common, right? Also known as the whiplash. Then we also have side impact collisions. This is the one where there's a lot of musculoskeletal injuries, also known as a lot of broken bones can happen on the side impact. For the rollover and rotational, since the car does rotate and rolls over, multiple injuries can happen, right? Please mute your microphones. Okay. Unless you do have a legitimate question. Okay, so those are the things that we need to know for motor vehicle collisions. Because if the dispatcher tells me, hey, you have a head-on collision, 2 patients, I can already see in my head, okay, possible up and over, possible down and under injuries. Okay, so that's why you need to know those type of collisions. Any questions with those? Great. Let's move on to the falls. There's only 2 concepts for falls, adult and child. If it's an adult, it's more than 20 feet, right? More than 20 feet of falls is considered significant mechanism of injury. Because you can fall from a bike, that's still trauma, yes, but it's non-significant. If it's more than 20 feet, that's something that I need to be concerned about. For a child, it's going to be more than 10 feet or 2 to 3 times their height. Okay, those are for your falls. Okay, so we talked about motor vehicle collision, then we talked about falls. The third type of mechanism of injury is penetrating trauma. Penetrating trauma is anything that goes through or breaks through the skin. Okay, so these are divided into 3 types. We have the low velocity, which is basically handheld devices, such as a knife or a pen. Okay, then we have the medium velocity, those are the ones with a higher power than hand weapons, such as a handgun, because you're using the trigger and it has some force that comes out of it. And then you have the high velocity. These ones are almost like military type weapons, right? Or assault rifles, automatic rifles. So more power than a typical handgun. So those are the 3 velocities that comes with penetrating trauma. So that's a third mechanism of injury. Then we have, and within the penetrating trauma, I kind of want to cover this as well. If you look at on page 277, there's a picture there of a bullet going through the insides of the patient. So the bullet might, what we call cavitate. So if you hear the word cavitation, it's basically creating a crater or a hole inside the patient, right? That's just part of what happens with a penetrating trauma injury. And then we have the blunt force trauma. Okay, that's the 4th one. Blunt force trauma. Good thing, the hardest thing about this is there's no break in the skin, right? So when you get punched in the face, there might be some bruising, but the bruising doesn't always show up right away. So it might take a couple of days, might take a couple of weeks, but bruising doesn't always show up right away. But the important part about blunt force trauma, there's no break in skin. So that is your mechanism of injury. Okay. Are there any questions about those several different types of mechanisms of injury listed on your textbook? Everybody good? Thumbs up if you're in the videos. I can know because the majority of you are in the videos anyway. Good, good, good. Wonderful. Nutella. Somebody's eating Nutella. I love Nutella. Sorry.
Hey,
yes.
I have a question. If the age is up to 15 for a child, does that mean at 16 they would be considered an adult?
Don't be too hanged up on the age. Yes, age is listed on there, and technicality wise, anybody under 15 and under, we're going to consider child, but it all goes down to if like when it comes to puberty, honestly, if they haven't reached puberty, if they don't have fully developed body for females and males, then usually they're considered a child. So they would fall underneath that category. But if they're like you know how some 12-year-olds look like an adult already, they're like, you look like you're 18. Then they might be considered and treated like an adult regardless of their age. Does that make sense, Williams?
Got it. Thank you.
Roger. Any more questions with mechanism of injury? Wonderful. Let's move on to the last part, nature of illness. Nature of illness is so easy. So it's medical. Medical, the reason why this is easy because especially if your patient is responsive, right? If your patient is responsive, you can get your nature of illness by simply asking your patient. Okay, that is the best source of the nature of illness. Hey, why did you call us today, Granny Smith? Right? You can, if the patient is not available, then you can get it from your family or bystanders. Hey, what happened? Why is it Granny Smith look like she's dazed? Right? And then the scene. So if the patient is not available, the bystanders are not available, then you can have your scene basically looking for clues. You're playing a little bit of detective or blues clues. Please mute your microphone. 646-27-2348.
I'm calling in for our study guide.
646-270-2348. This is your last warning. I will force mute you if you don't mute your mic. See, why does everybody have to be warned and threatened before they do stuff? Right. Moving on. Okay, so that is for your nature of illness, patient, family members, bystanders, and the scene. Okay, one thing that's listed on your textbook as well they say it's for trauma, but I say it's for both. Index of suspicion, right? High index of suspicion. You always want to make sure that, oh, it's just a little nosebleed. That's nothing. Nope, high index of suspicion. You don't know what actually happened. You weren't there, so you want to make sure that, hey, there might be other injuries that I'm not seeing right now. Okay. So after you determine, so BSI scene safety is done, you've determined if it's MOI or NOI. Now it's time to identify your next two. How many patients am I dealing with? And do I need advanced life support or additional help? After that, I'm going to consider C-spine stability, C-spine precautions. Do I need to just forego it for now? Or am I going to have to stabilize the C-spine? And we're introducing this to you now because in Mod 5, this is going to be very critical, stabilizing the C-spine, right? Because in the C-spine, a lot of things gets controlled. Movement as well as breathing is on your C-spine. That's why it's very important, okay? So that's basically a quick breakdown of scene size up, right? Any questions with that class? Good, thumbs up if you're on the video. Cool, dudes.
Taking one?
Yes.
Could you explain the cavitation again? What did you say about the cavitation? That was important.
Sure, no problem. Cavitation is just basically creating a hole or a crater. So if you get stabbed, it's almost like somebody's putting a hole in you, right? Or if you get shot, okay, there's like this cavitation that gets created inside your body. So cavity, if once you hear the word cavity, think of that as in the medical field, that basically means some like a hole or something. Like if you have cavity in your teeth, that basically there's a hole in your tooth, right? So same thing with the body. If there's cavities, like that means there's an opening somewhere. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, no problem. Right, any more questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, I'm going to do another share screen. Now I'm going to go ahead and share to you primary assessment. See, told you guys scene size up pretty easy peasy. Easy peasy. All right, I'm still Oops, you guys don't see that. Share screen. Oh my gosh, how do I do, hold on. Sorry, everybody, sorry. Trying to figure out this. Perfect, there we go. All right, so let's talk about, we already talked about the scene size up, the very first part of your patient assessment. Before I begin, can somebody with audio capability let me know if you're seeing it, yes or no?
Yep.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right, so here is the quick acronym for primary assessment. Okay, GLC, ABCTP. Don't worry, we're going to go over this one by one, but this is a quick acronym that I've taught. It's probably taught to you in a different way from the alpha side, but regardless, this is the general concept of primary assessment. GLC, ABCTP. Everybody comes up with like mnemonics to remember this. Good loving couples always bark eyes together, period, or whatever you want to come up with. But this is how I remember my primary assessment and to ensure that I don't miss it. Okay, so here's what it stands for. G stands for general impression. L is level of consciousness. C is chief complaint. A is airway. B is breathing. C is circulation. T is treat for shock. P is priority. Oops, I misspelled that, my bad. For transport. Okay, so GLC, ABCTP. And like I said, I'm going to break this down for you guys one by one here. I just wanted you guys to see a quick breakdown. And like I said, you have this available to you in your emails if you're looking, if you're going to check, if you're checking on them right now. So let's talk about the first few parts. So before you jump into your primary assessment, you want to come up with, what do I see, hear, or smell? Okay, so first of all, this helps you use your senses, because this helps you come up with a general impression of your patient, which is the first one. Your general impression of your patient can either be well or poor. If your patient is talking to you, stable, they look like they're stable, hey, they might be well in condition. But if they're having dyspnea, they look like they're having trouble breathing because they're in the tripod or in the sniffing position, they're probably going to be more of a poor general impression. So that's your G. Next is the L. Okay, level of consciousness. A lot of our students from our last class got so confused with this, so we're breaking this early on. Your level of consciousness, you're using the acronym AVPU. If they're talking to you, you're going to use the alert of the AVPU, which is the letter A. You ask 3 questions out of that. What is your name? Where are you? What time is it? Right? That is your, those are the 3 things. Then you're going to determine if your patient is A&O. A&O stands for alert and oriented times how many? How many did they answer out of this alert questions? Is it 3? Then if that's so, they're A&O times 3. Is it 2? Then A&O times 2. If it's 1, A&O times 1. If it's 0, A&O times 0. Look at this slide. I put it there too. If alert doesn't work, use your verbal stimuli. H1, what's a verbal stimuli? Well, you can say, sir, you can hear me. Please squeeze my fingers or blink your eyes. Those are verbal stimuli. Well, no response from the patient. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to my P. If verbal doesn't work, then I'm going to use my painful stimuli. That's when I do a sternum rub. Okay, rub them by the breastbone. Okay, using your knuckles, or pinch them on the shoulder area. If all else fails, okay, then that's when you're going to start. Then you're going to deem your patient unresponsive. Please do not think of your patient unresponsive as not breathing, no pulse, dead. Right? Unresponsive just basically means they didn't respond to your alert, to your verbal, and your painful stimuli. Okay, so that is your level of consciousness. If you're typing in the chat box, I don't see it right now. I will get to your questions here shortly, just in case you're typing in, because it's notifying me that there are messages coming through. Then we have the C, chief complaint. There's a slash right there, apparent life threats. If they're talking to you, then you can get your chief complaint. Basically, you can simply ask that by saying, get that by asking, sir, ma'am, why did you call us today? That will give you your chief complaint. Oh, because my chest is hurting. Okay, patient's chief complaint, chest is hurting. But what if they're unresponsive? Or what if they're responding to verbal or painful stimuli? How are you going to get a chief complaint? Well, it's hard to get one. So all you can do are apparent life threats. That basically means my possible life threats are And you'll learn this in Mod 5, internal external bleeding, head, neck, spine injury. That's the worst possible case. Remember, high index of suspicion? You want to think of worst possible case scenarios when you're doing that, right? So that is for your apparent life threats if you cannot elicit a chief complaint from your patient. So that is your GLC. Okay, moving on here. If you do have questions, make sure you write it down, save it, because after I end this screen, share screen, I'll take questions. Right. Then we have our ABC, starting with the airway. Look at that. On the airway, as you can see on your screen, open, clear, secure. 3 things that we need to do. You already know how to open the airway. Jaw thrust maneuver, head tilt, chin lift. You're going to clear the airway, suction no more than 10 seconds. NREMT and some books says 15 seconds. So 10 or 15 seconds, right? Then we're going to secure. How are you going to secure? OPA or NPA? Which one's which? Gag reflex, take off the OPA, insert an NPA. On responsive patients, then you're probably going to use an OPA as long as they don't have a gag reflex. Semi-responsive, such as responding to painful or verbal stimuli, or they're somewhat A&O times 1 or 2, then you're probably going to use an NPA on that one if needed. Breathing, 3 things as well. Expose the chest. Rate and quality for breathing, O2 therapy. Let's talk about expose the chest first. What are the possible injuries of my patient? Okay, possible life-threatening injuries. Okay, you're not exposing the chest to see the rise and fall of the chest. You're exposing it to see what are the life-threatening injuries that compromises the breathing. Then I want to determine the rate and quality, 30 times 2. Is it rapid and shallow? Is it 28 and rapid? Because that will determine what type of O2 therapy am I going to do. Am I going to give nasal non-rebreather mask? Is it going to be a nasal cannula? Is it going to be a bag valve mask? What am I going to do? You're going to determine that based on your rate and quality. Then we have the C, circulation. Circulation is also 3 things. Like you see that? There's a pattern going on here. 3 in the airway, 3 in the breathing, 3 in the circulation. Profuse bleeds. What is profuse bleeds? That basically another word for life-threatening bleeding. You want to scan from head to toe for that one, because if there's a profuse bleed, we want to make sure that we treat that right away. Then I'm going to determine another rate and quality of the pulse, 30-second times 2. Then your skin CTC, color, temperature, and condition of the skin for the circulation. After you've done all that, you're going to treat your patient for shock. Okay, all your patients, most likely 99.9% of the time, in skills specifically, your patient will have early signs and symptoms of shock. So you're going to cover them with a blanket or magical blanket. If needed, and if there is no compromise, if needed, okay, if they're unresponsive, you're going to put your patient into supine position. Because if y'all remember back in Mod 1, supine position is the best position, okay, when your patient is in shock. No more that the Trendelenburg or lifting the legs is a no-no, right? We place them in the supine. But if they're responsive, obviously you're not going to push a Granny Smith to the stretcher and like, you lay down, you're in shock. No. Cover them with a blanket and put them in the Fowler's or semi-Fowler's position if needed. And last but not the least, the P, priority for transport. Are they a high or low priority? If they're experiencing a lot of unstableness and you think that they have most of the time, if they have a poor general impression, then they're most likely going to be a high priority for patient. If they have problems with the airway, breathing, or circulation, then they're most likely going to be a high priority patient. If there are apparent life threats or if they have significant MOI, mechanism of injury, then they're probably going to be high priority for high priority patient. Okay, so that is your primary assessment. Let me just go back to that again. GLC, ABCPP. General impression, level of consciousness, chief complaint, apparent life threats, airway, breathing, circulation, treat for shock, and priority for transport. I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to go ahead and entertain questions right now. So what are my questions?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear somebody trying to ask a question. Hello? What's the question? Somebody needs to mute their mics. All right, so no questions about that?
I have a question, Nathan.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, in which part of the assessment what's my question? Oh yeah, in which part of the assessment does the implied consent come in? Like as far like if they don't have the level of consciousness.
Very good.
The level of consciousness part.
Yes, that's going to be falling under now you're going into the weeds of the verbalizations when it comes to trauma and medical assessment, but I'm glad you asked that. Question is, when does the consent comes into play? Well, that's when your patient is unresponsive based on implied consent. If they're unresponsive or if they're only responsive to painful and verbal stimuli, then you're going to go and continue on with your primary assessment based on implied consent. Okay, so yes, it's during the level of consciousness that you're going to determine patient consent. If you're talking to them, obviously you can get the informed consent from your patient if they're ANO. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, next question from the chat box. H1, during airway breathing and circulation, when would you use an NPA or a non-rebreather mask? Well, that's a very general question, but if your patient has a compromise on their airway, okay, and they need, remember, we're opening their airway, clearing their airway, and securing their airway. If my patient is talking to me and you're talking, your airway is patent. Remember what a patent means? Hold on a second, guys. Somebody's calling. My bad. Sorry about that. All right. So airway breathing and circulation, right? So if your patient is talking to you, obviously they have a patent airway, so there's no need to stick an NPA or an OPA for somebody who's talking, right? Well, my H1 said open, clear, secure. No, if they're talking to you, airway's patent, so there's no need to go through the open, clear, secure process. So that should, NPA is also used for patients that are responsive to verbal, painful, or they're completely unresponsive. Okay, so that's when you would use an NPA. Now, to answer, does that answer your question, Lopez? Okay, now when would you use an NRB? Well, depending on your rate and quality of your patient. That's why you do your rate and quality 30 times 2. If your patient is in early signs of respiratory distress, as we talked about in Mod 2, then you're going to go back to that chart again. Okay, if it's early signs of respiratory distress, then non-rebreather would be utilized for your patient. Does that make sense? Cool. Right. Any more questions about that slide that I just quickly shared to y'all?
HM1, if the patient doesn't say the OPA, he doesn't go with it, or the MPA, he doesn't like it, don't you go down to the NRB?
I'm sorry, ask that question again one more time because I think I kind of missed that.
Like say if the patient doesn't accept the OPA or the NPA, like say he's gagging on the OPA or he's not comfortable with it, wouldn't you go down to an NRB?
Negative. An NPA or OPA will be only utilized if your patient is there's a compromise to their airway. And majority of the times, these are patients that have problems with controlling it, such as patients that are unresponsive. The reason why we secure the airway using an OPA or an NPA is because there's a compromise that airway is not going to stay open. Okay, so an OPA and an NPA is never going to be combined with an NRB. That's not going to do them any good because an NRB and a nasal cannula simply blows air into their face. What would work is if you use an NPA or an OPA, you're either going to use a BVM along with that. Okay, so that's basically the concept behind it. Now, if the OPA is not being tolerated and the NPA cannot be used, then you're simply going to have to possibly bag valve your patient and transport right away because you're not advanced EMT or you're not a paramedic and you cannot use advanced devices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Question from the chat box. HM1, what do you mean by 30 times 2? Check the pulse, 30 seconds, multiply by 2. Pulse, breathing, same thing, 30 seconds times 2. Make sense, everyone? Right, any more questions with that little screen share that I just did for primary assessment? All right. So let's move on to the little details. So that's a general. Now you have an overview of what the primary assessment is. So remember, scene size up, after scene size up is primary assessment. The whole point of primary assessment is to treat life-threatening injuries, okay? Immediate life threats. I'm going to repeat that. The whole point of primary assessment is to identify and treat life-threatening injuries, okay? You're not just there just because, hey, it's GLC, ABC, TP. No, you're there to find out what's going on with my patient. Is there anything that's compromising the A, B, and C's? Because if there is, I'm going to try to fix that. If there's an airway that's not clear, I got to clear it. If it's not secure, I got to secure it. Okay, if there's breathing, then I will provide oxygen. If it's a circulation issue and they're bleeding out, I got to control the bleeding. And you'll learn majority of those around Mod 5 timeframe, but the concept starts now in Mod 3. This is your foundation of your patient assessment. Okay, so that is the oh, you got to turn down your volume.
Got it. I'm sorry. If we get the, I guess like the letters wrong when we're actually doing the assessment, like mix it up and not go straight through it, like the general impression and all of that, verbatim, will we be penalized for it?
Yes, when it comes to skills, order is very important. Okay, you can't go from general impression to priority for patient. That's just wrong. You're going to automatically fail for that one. There's a reason why we provide you with acronyms, and you have to follow that in order when it comes to skills. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, right. So let's move on for primary assessment. So we already talked about performing it. So on page 285, it introduced to you the key term of intervention. So interventions is anything that we do for our patients, right, on how we've helped them. This can involve medications or giving them oxygen. That's an example of intervention as well. Okay, so let's skip over that specific picture right there, but that's just a visual representation of the GLC ABCTP. H1, I didn't see the treat for shock in the book. Well, because the treat for shock is underneath circulation, and most students actually forget treating for shock, and it's causing them to fail skills. So what we did was, let's isolate the treat for shock and put it right underneath circulation so students don't forget it. Okay, so that's why the treat for shock is kind of isolated on that one. Okay, so let's talk about the chief complaint, right? So the chief complaint, this is basically the main reason why you were called. This is coming directly from your patient, right? And you can easily ask this, hey, ma'am, why did you call us today? Boom, that's your chief complaint right there. Okay. Then the book on page 290 talks about mental status. Use the acronym AVPU. I already went over that on your overview, but let me just go through that again. AVPU stands for alert, verbal, painful, unresponsive. Alert is when they're talking to me. Hey, what is your name? Where are you? What time is it? Okay. And then the V is verbal stimuli. So if you can hear me, can you squeeze my fingers or blink your eyes? Doesn't work? Sternum rub, okay, or pinch on the shoulder. If all else fails, my patient is unresponsive. So that is your AVPU. The reason why it's on there on the primary assessment, because the early signs and symptoms of shock, when your patient is experiencing that, the first thing that gets affected is your brain, right? Another word for shock is what? What is another word for shock? For those of you in the chat box, what's another word for shock? Very good. Hypoperfusion. Hypoperfusion is the lack of oxygen, right? And the brain, when there's lack of oxygen, it realizes it right away. And that's when your patient starts becoming altered mental status. Okay, so that's why we assess the AVPU first. Question from the chat box. Are we just assuming all patients will be treated for shock for training? Or is this something that typically happens in the field? Training purposes, treat for shock is there as a checklist. Not all your patients will be on shock, but it's a good thing to remember that treating for shock has to be done in the primary assessment. If I wait at my secondary assessment, your patient's condition might decline. So that blanket, you covering that blanket seems like a simple task for now, but anytime there's early signs, anything at all of shock, then yes, the treating for shock will be included there. In the field, hey, it's just a precautionary measure. We will just want to make sure. Does that make sense, Williams? Okay, right. So that's for your assessmental status. Any questions so far? Okay, good. Now let's go with the ABCs. Airway, already talked about that. Airway is three things. Open the airway, clear the airway, secure the airway. HM1, if my patient's talking to me, do I still have to do open, clear, secure? Negative. You don't do that, okay? There's no need to tell Granny Smith, hey, Granny Smith, I know you're talking to me, but I got to do a head tilt chin lift. Do you know how awkward that is? Okay, so no need for open, clear, secure if they're talking to you because their airway's patent. Then you have the breathing, okay? So the breathing, we already assessed that. We're gonna expose the chest, magic mic the chest for possible life-threatening injuries, determine the rate and quality, check the breathing, 30-second times 2. Note I said rate and quality, okay? Because I could be breathing 24, but it's normal. So, or I could be breathing 24, but it's labored breathing. So those are two different things, and it will all depend on how you're gonna provide oxygen to your patient. Okay, and most of the time, the top 3 oxygen devices that you might use: NRB, nasal cannula, BVM. Top 3 that's going to use. Majority of the time, medical patients or non-significant, medical responsive and non-significant trauma patient most likely gets an NRB and nasal cannula. Most likely. Trauma patients that are significant MOI that are unresponsive and in unresponsive medical patients most likely will get BVM because, again, unresponsive patients typically lose control of their breathing and blocks their airway. So that's why, okay? And then on page 292, if you guys are on your book, go ahead and flip over that specific page, 292. Right, so HM1, I remember in a class about the CAB process, okay? When would I use the CAB? The only time you would use CAB is if your patient is unresponsive, doesn't have a pulse, and is not breathing. Basically CPR. You're actually going to learn that on Thursday. We have a full day of BLS, right? So that's when the CAB kind of turns around. You start with the compression, right? Then you're going to provide with breathing, right? And you're going to provide airway for your patients. Questions from the thing. For skill purposes, all patients will be treated for possible shock and dignity purposes. In real life, you will not always treat for shock. It is going to be dependent. Oh, you're just answering a question. Yes, I already did answer that, but yes, that's correct also, whoever typed that in the chat box, okay? Right, so any questions with that class? Airway, breathing. Okay, now let's move on to circulation. So circulation, this is just basically checking for your patient's profuse bleeding, right? You wanna make sure, hey, let me scan real quick for any profuse bleed, because that profuse bleed, what's in the blood? What does the blood carry that the body needs, that the brain needs, that the cell needs?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. Oxygen is in the blood. So if blood's spurting out and you're not controlling it, your patient's like blood, okay? And then you also have pulse, okay? Because 30-second times 2, an increased pulse with labored breathing, an increased pulse, increased breathing, and if I check my patient's CTC, color temperature condition, and they're pale, cool, diaphoretic, classic signs of signs and symptoms of shock, okay? So that's your ABCs, right? Any questions with that class? All right, also part of this, right after that, if your patient needs it, you're gonna treat for shock, okay? Early signs and symptoms of shock, and it's just a precautionary measure. Even though it's not that bad yet, you wanna treat for shock, cover by a blanket, or put them in a supine position. Last but not the least, you're going to determine your patient's priority for transport. If you look over on page 297, there is basically a quick overview over there of what would be considered a high priority patient, okay? If you have a poor general impression, unresponsive patients, responsive but they're not following commands, right? So for example, Granny Smith. Okay, Granny Smith is not following simple directions and she seems like she's dazed and out of nowhere. Well, that's also high priority. If your patient is in shock, complicated childbirth, which you will learn around mod 6, chest pain with cardiac problems, mod 4, uncontrolled bleeding, mod 5, severe pain anywhere, high priority for transport. Supine position, is it treating for shock? Along with the blanket, yes. Okay, along with the blanket, when you put your patient in the supine position, remember, if they're unresponsive, keeping them in the supine will basically allow the blood to circulate. Okay, CAB is CPR. Yes, when your patient is unresponsive, no pulse, and not breathing, the ABC turns into CAB to where what's basically known as the CPR. Okay, so that's basically the end of the primary assessment. Are there any questions about that class? I need to make sure that you know this because primary assessment is actually a very important part of your patient assessment. This is where we treat life-threatening injuries. So are there any questions about that at all? No question.
Question one.
Yes.
Quick question. For the test tomorrow, are we going to be seeing like questions for the primary assessment in that order? Like, are we going to have to like place, like answer questions like say in the general impression, what do you do? Is it going to be something like that? Can you answer that?
No, I cannot answer that question because it's almost like telling you this is what's going to be on the test. However, what I can tell you is it is important for you to understand where am I in my patient assessment process. So let's say, for example, it gives you this specific scenario. Ask yourself, am I in the secondary assessment? If so, what part of the secondary assessment have I completed already? Same thing with the primary. Okay, it looks like I'm still in the primary assessment based on this scenario. Based on my choices, what's the next step that I'm going to do? So are they going to ask you, what is the G in GLC ABCTP? Possibly not. Okay, when it comes to those things, those are just mnemonics that we provided for you so you know the algorithm when it comes to our primary assessment. Perfect world scenario, schoolhouse scenario, yes, we follow GLC ABCTP. Real world scenario probably gets jumbled up here and there, but again, you're in a schoolhouse. You're learning your basic foundations. So that's why. Does that make sense, everybody? Does that answer your question a little bit? Whoever asked that question? Yes? No? Maybe?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Okay. Right, so any questions about that at all, class? Right, so like I said, scene size up in primary assessment are usually pretty quick overviews, but are we safe to move on? Because I'm gonna add on to you guys. That's your second part of your patient assessment. We're gonna move on right now, okay? So vital signs and monitoring devices. Just a caveat right now, I'm just following the order of the chapters in the book, but vital signs is actually a part of what patient assessment? What part of your patient assessment is vital signs part of? Is it scene size up? Is it primary? Is it secondary? Is it reassessment? Those are your four major parts. Very good. Secondary. Okay, we got it. Secondary assessment. Okay, secondary assessment is that's part of your vital signs. Okay, so let's talk about vital signs real quick. Okay, so vital signs, there's several basic vital signs that you're going to check from your patient, right? You have the respiration, pulse, skin CTC, right? Then you have we're also going to talk about cap refill here shortly. Then you have the patient's pupils, eyes, because eyes, you know what they say about windows to the soul? Well, eyes are the windows of the EMT when they're possible head and trauma injury, right? And blood pressure, okay, which is something that you will have to learn from here on out, right? For both classes, I want you guys to actually check 3 blood pressures every day from here on out. That's the only way that you're going to be proficient for it. You have medically experienced personnel in your class, have them help you out as well. There is no secrets on how to be good at BP cuff. The only way you're going to do that is by practicing. Okay, so let's talk about vital signs real quick. Let's talk about pulse. We check the pulse by doing checking the radial pulse, right? For an adult, if they're responsive. If they're unresponsive, we're going to check the carotid. But either way, we want to use about 2 or 3 fingers, right? Never the thumb, because the thumb has its own pulse. And the book mentioned here, if the patient has below 60 heart rate, it's bradycardia. Above 100, that is tachycardia. Okay. We also want to talk about pulse quality. So this is where is the pulse bounding strong? Is it thready? Because you have those individuals that have a pulse, but it's very, very weak because of the injuries that they've sustained. Okay. So again, you're going to use 30-second times 2 for that one. Okay. And then you're also, if the patient has an irregular pulse, you're going to go for a full 60-second. okay, a full 60 seconds. Okay, so basically, if 30, that seems like an irregular pulse, then add an additional 30 seconds to that just to verify that the patient does have an accurate pulse for that one. But generally, skills-wise, vital signs-wise, and out in the field, 30-second times 2 is the practice. Okay, makes sense, everyone? Okay, cool. All right, then we have respiration. Okay, respiration is done in the same way. Respiration is 30-second times 2 for your patient. That is 1 inhale and 1 exhale. That's 1 breathing. You count that for 30-second times 2. We're gonna have to know. We're gonna have to know the different types of quality of breathing. Is it normal? Is it shallow? So those that with asthma attack. Okay, is it labored, right? Having a hard time breathing, and noisy breathing, stridor, wheezing. Those are examples of irregular breathing when it comes, or irregular respiration from your patient, okay? And then we also have the rhythm of the breathing. Is it regular or irregular? Okay, so those are all for your respiratory quality. Question H1, there's a lot of vital signs on the table. Do I need to memorize them? Ooh, I will send you guys a quick table. I left it at work. But there should be, do you guys have your student guides for EMT, that white packet? Yes. Okay, if you look, yes, that one, the one that you're showing right now on the camera, emergency medical technician student packet, flip over that and look for the mod 3 section and look over the vital signs. And can you, if you can please flip over to the camera for me. I left mine at home. I mean, at work. Yes, that's the one. That's the one that you want to memorize for adult, child, and infant. Specifically, if you can't memorize all of it, all I'm asking for you for now is just the adult at least. The reason behind that is there will be scenarios that will ask you, hey, this is the vital signs of your patient. 10 minutes later, this is now their vital signs. Is your patient improving? Are they stable? Are they not stable? Well, if you don't know what's the normal, then it's hard to really determine what's not, if they're improving or declining, right? So you want to make sure, at least for the adults, look over what? Okay, are you asking me, or are you having an attitude? Because the way I'm reading this right now, look over what? Okay. So you want to look over the vital signs section of your emergency medical student packet guide. Okay, there we gave you guys a white packet. Okay, and if you flip over to the mod 3 section of that white packet, again, it's called the Emergency Medical Technician Student Packet. It's a white book. Look over the vital signs and look over the adult section at least. Yep, everybody's showing it. I want you to at least memorize for now. For now, I'm going to be very gracious to y'all. Just the adult section. Okay? All right. Moving on. Let's talk about the skin, right? So the skin on page 314, there's 2 tables there. The skin has different possible colors: pink, pale, cyanotic, flush, jaundice, mottled. Okay, so pink, that's the normal color. So I don't want to hear the words normal anymore. If it's normal, whether they have a brown skin color, black skin color, white skin color, everybody will, if it's normal, okay, pink. Well, HM1, what if it's they have a darker complexion? Where do I look? Well, where do you look? Right? Nail beds, palms, okay, gums, lips, right? Eyelids. Those are possible things where you can look for when you're looking for the pinkness of somebody's skin, right? Pale means they're probably experiencing shock, or those that are experiencing emotional distress. Cyanotic, the bluish gray color, lack of oxygen. Flush, basically heat exhaustion. Jaundice, that's the yellow, problems with the liver. Mottled, okay, everybody wants you mottled. Everybody always get this. HM1, what's mottled? Around mod 4 and mod 5. Well, mottled is a blotchy color, right? So that's like those spots. Okay, that's basically mottled. And if you still need more visualization, go to Google, look up mottled skin color, and you will see what we're talking about, like patches. Okay. So that's for the color. Then you have the temperature and condition. So there's about only several things about temperature and condition. You're not gonna, it's hard to measure temperature out in the field, so we use the back of our hand, right? So we can experience cool, clammy, cold, moist, cold, dry, hot, moist, okay? So when you hear CTC, you're supposed to give me 3 things. What's the color? What's the temperature? What's the condition of your patient? Okay, right. So that's just one part. So that's the main part of the patient's CTC. Okay, any questions with that, class? Okay, let's move on. Now let's talk about, excuse me, pediatric, not pediatric, I'm sorry, the pupils, okay? So when it comes to the pupils, one thing that we do with that is shine a pen light on it. We're looking for pearl, okay? I'm gonna type it in, P-R-R-L, pearl. Stands for pupils equal round reactive to light. Let me say that again, pupils equal round reactive to light, pearl, okay? Not P-A-R-L, pearl, P-R-R-L. So that's what we want to see. But sometimes the pupils are going to be unequal. One's dilated, one's constricted, or both are constricted and not reacting to light. So there's several things on page 316. There's several things of what can that mean. I'm not going to go over that in detail, but look over that specific table. What do those pupils mean when it's one's dilated and the other one's not? Okay, so that's for your pupils. Most of the time when the pupils are not reacting to light, okay, when there's lack of reactivity, there's probably lack of oxygen to the brain. Or if they're unequal, one's dilated, one's constricted, there's probably a head trauma. That's why we look at the eyes as well. And it could also be a sign of shock for your patients for pearl. Everybody clear on that? Okay, very good. Now let's talk about everybody's favorite vital sign, blood pressure. Blood pressure, okay? So let me talk about what the blood pressure first. There's two things with the blood pressure, systolic and diastolic. Systolic is the first sound that you hear when you're doing your manual BP, and then diastolic is the last faintest sound that you hear when you're doing your manual BP. Systolic is when the heart contracts, and diastolic is when the heart relaxes and refills. That's basically the difference, okay? So when it comes to blood pressure, what are we supposed to do? Well, first off, right, we want to locate, for those of you that are watching the video, if you're looking at me right now, we want to locate first the artery, okay, the brachial artery specifically, and most of the time you do that by palpating for that brachial artery. Then that's where you're going to place your BP cuff about how many inches away from the brachial artery. For those of you that are in the audio, how many inches should I place that? How high above should I place that?
1 inch.
How many?
1 inch.
1 inch. Okay, who says 2 inches? Okay, it's about 1 to 2 inches away from the brachial artery. You don't want it to be here at the crevice, so you want to make sure it's just a little tad bit high on that crevice or that crease of your elbow. Okay, yes, what's your question?
Was it the placement of the cuff, Asian one?
Yes, the placement of the cuff.
Yes, so we were told by Sir Andy that it should be 2/3, so it's like in here. So we're not.
So as long as it's like, so you see where this crevice is, like the crease of your elbow, as long as you're not on there, okay, that's where you want to position that BP cuff on there. Does that make sense?
Yes, Asian one.
Okay, right. And then you want to position the stethoscope, right, to where you felt the brachial artery. And then we're going to go by with a textbook way of identifying this, right? You don't want the stethoscope to be underneath the BP cuff, right? Because if you put it underneath the BP cuff, when you're squeezing the BP cuff, you're going to start to hear the crackle, right? You want to make sure it's below, okay, the BP cuff, not under, but below. Then you're going to squeeze all the way up till you stop hearing the sound. And then you're going to pump up about 30 more, right? So pump, 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 pump till I don't hear the sound. And then I pump up about 30 more, So if I stop hearing the sound at 120, then I keep pumping all the way up to 150, right? Then I start releasing. And then the first sound that I hear is the systolic. And then the last sound that I hear is the diastolic. That is for your manual blood pressure. And that is just one way of obtaining it. The second way of obtaining a blood pressure is by palpation. So sometimes stethoscope, the surroundings can be very loud. So what I can do is, instead of using the stethoscope, I can palpate the brachial artery. So what I can do is I can squeeze, 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 squeeze until the brachial disappears. And then when I release, wherever the gauge lands, when I first release it, that's going to be my systolic. And obviously I'm not going to have a diastolic, so I'm going to put over P or over palp. Okay, so that's basically telling the medical personnel, hey, we don't have a stethoscope, so we just did a palpation method of the blood pressure when it comes to our patient. And the last one is called a automatic one, or the monitor one. Even 3-year-old kids can do this. All they got to do is insert their arm on there, press a button, hit start, and then it starts inflating. Right? That's basically what you get for those type of patients that are using the monitor. So 3 ways to do it: by manual BP, by palpation, and by the monitor or the automatic monitoring device BP. Okay. Any questions for that class? All right, so let's move on. So for patients that are less than 3 years old, it's hard to get a blood pressure for them. Just in a pre-hospital setting, it is not practice to get a blood pressure from children that are less than 3 years old. The reason behind this is majority of the times the younger portion of the pediatric patient, they usually have healthy hearts. And the whole point of a BP is to measure how hard the heart is working. So with 3 years old and below, we typically don't do that in hospital settings. However, they might have a specialty one. So we're not going to use a BP cuff. However, what we can utilize is what we call a cap refill. So that's basically squeezing your finger, right? Releasing, okay? And then you're waiting from your finger to release from white to pink. Should be about less than 2 seconds, right? If it's more than 2 seconds, that's probably a sign of shock. Make sense, everyone? Okay, moving on. Any questions so far? Everybody good? Okay, let's move on to temperature, right? So in a pre-hospital setting, we don't have thermometers majority of the time. We're not going to have thermometers, but we just want to mention about temperature. Okay, because you might be an EMS agency where you're required to do a temperature. So we can get it through the mouth. You can get it inside the ear. Okay, that's called the tympanic. Or you can get a temporal. So basically the ones that, for those of you that went to sick call recently, they actually changed to the temporal one to where you just roll a ball thermometer on your forehead. You can also get a rectal thermometer for your patients that actually, and it's usually commonly used out in a, if you're like in a combat setting and you need to get a temperature, you basically stick a thermometer in the rectum. But for patients that are normal, that don't have that severe heat distress, there's no need to be like, oh, I'm going to check your temperature, your rectal temperature now. Okay. That's negative right there, everybody. Okay. Right. So those are the different ways that you can get your temperature. Okay. Is that clear, class? Good. Then we have our oxygen saturation, which is the last, or second to the last part right here. Oxygen saturation. So this last 3 ones, what do you call this? Temperature, oxygen saturation, and blood glucose. All those 3 are local, depending on local protocol, right? They're usually not part of basic baseline vital signs, but we need to teach it to you because they're slowly being mandated for all EMS agencies, and I need you to know them as well. So the device that we use to measure the oxygen for is called the pulse oximeter, and it's measuring oxygen saturation, also known as SpO2, how much oxygen is in the blood. So if you look at page 324, interpreting the readings, 96 to 100%, that's normal. 91 to 95%, mild hypoxia. 86 to 90%, moderate hypoxia. And 85% or less, severe hypoxia. I'm going to repeat that. 96 to 100, normal SpO2. Mild hypoxia, 91 to 95. Moderate hypoxia, 86 to 90. Severe hypoxia, less than 85. Okay, so again, that's all on page 324. And then on page 325, these are just several things that can affect your pulse ox readings. So patients that are in shock, obviously because there's not enough oxygen in their blood already. So the pulse oximeter might give you a false reading. Patients that have nail polish also might affect that. In the EMT, out in practice, what we've done also as well is we clip it on the earlobes if the patient does have a lot of nail polish and we don't have the nail polish remover to do that, because there's a lot of capillaries on here, and you'll still be able to measure oxygen saturation from your patients, okay? So that is for your oxygen saturation. Any questions for that class? All right, last but not the least for this chapter, blood glucose meters right here, blood glucose. As EMTs period, we cannot just do blood glucose. This is a local protocol, okay, because it involves penetrating the skin. Okay, so the blood glucose reading for BMTCP, you are allowed, you as an EMT in BMTCP, you're allowed to basically check blood glucose. Okay, you can do that. And you're going to learn how to properly do it when you get to nursing. So we're not going to go too much in detail with the steps of how to properly administer that, because in nursing, you get a step by step by step, and you're going to prick each other on that one as well. Okay, for a last question for this chapter, how often do we measure a stable patient? How often are the vital signs rechecked? Very good, 15 minutes. And how often do we check for an unstable patient? Unstable, 5. So remember that, 5 minutes unstable, 15 minutes stable. Okay, so any questions with that, class? All right, so time on deck is 8:24, but we'll call it at 8:25, right? We'll pause for about 5 minutes, right? Everybody good with that? 1 hour, and we already covered 3 chapters, right? So like I told you guys, it's a very easy one. I'm going to spend majority of the last few hour, my bulk of it will be secondary assessment, and then we'll quickly go over communication, right? Everybody good with that one? Okay, so take about 5 minutes, drink water. Please do not unmute your mics, and do not type anything crazy on the chat box. Again, this is a recorded session. You're just ruining it for your shipmates, and those that are listening to this via SoundCloud is also going to be interrupted. So please be courteous and don't do anything crazy. I will see you guys in 5 minutes.